Conflict in the Colonies by Anne Rossi. While patriots in all 13 American colonies were speaking of freedom, Massachusetts was the location of important events that led to the beginning of the American Revolution. In this book, you will read about how events in and around Boston led to the first shots being fired in the battle for independence. Vocabulary: Patriot, Militia, Minutemen, Revenue, Tyranny, Repeal, Tariff, Boycott, Massacre, Intolerable. The Revolution begins. In February 1775, Great Britain's lawmakers declared that Massachusetts was in open rebellion against the king and government. 2 months later, Thomas Gage, the British general who controlled Boston, received orders to arrest leaders of the rebellion, including Samuel Adams. The Patriot leaders learned of this and fled to Lexington. On April 18, 1775, Patriots in Boston learned that British soldiers were planning a nighttime march to Lexington to search for the Patriot leaders, and then to Concord to destroy Patriot supplies. They knew that the militia must be warned. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott rode to Lexington to warn the Patriot leaders, but a British patrol stopped Revere and Dawes as they left. Only Prescott reached Concord, where he alerted the militia. Minutemen were ready when the British arrived in Lexington. The next day, fighting began between British soldiers and American patriots in Lexington. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it marked the beginning of the Revolutionary War in North America. But how had this come about? All of the colonists were British, and very few had friends and family in Great Britain. The colonists had fought alongside the British during the French and Indian War. Surely they were still loyal to the king. How could they be fighting each other? To find out, we need to look back to 1763. The shot heard round the world. In 1836, Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American writer, wrote about these events. He called the first shot fired by the Patriots at Lexington the shot heard round the world. The Patriots' success in gaining independence inspired people in many other lands to fight for the independence of their own countries. Britain and the American colonies in 1763. From 1756 to 1763, all the great powers of Europe were engaged in the 7 Years' War. France, Austria, Great Britain, Russia, and other countries battled over land in Europe. They also fought over their colonies. England and France fought over and in their colonies in North America. This part of the larger European war was known as the French and Indian War. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, the French and Indian War ended with it. Great Britain had won most of France's North American territories. Many American colonists were pleased to be part of the powerful British Empire. With the war over, King George III of Great Britain began to take a greater interest in his colonies in the Americas. They were much larger now, and he had the time to govern them more closely. Unfortunately for King George, new ideas were becoming popular in the 1700s, ideas that would make it difficult for him to control his colonies. The term natural rights was beginning to be used in political discussions and in writing. People began talking about the rights of the individual. Among the many rights they discussed were the right to be free, to own property, and to participate in government. People in Europe were only able to talk about these ideas. They still had rulers and traditions that limited their rights and freedoms. However, in the 13 colonies, people had long enjoyed these and many other rights and freedoms. American colonists had begun to think that these were rights and freedoms that they would always have. When Great Britain's Parliament and King began passing new laws, many colonists felt that their rights and freedoms were being threatened. Acts and reactions. The 7 Years' War left Great Britain with huge debts. Many British leaders felt that the American colonies should help pay these war debts. British soldiers offered protection. Surely the colonists would be glad to help pay for all this. In 1764, the British government began passing laws that they hoped would increase revenues or money coming in from the American colonies. The first law was the Revenue Act of 1764, also called the Sugar Act. It set taxes on sugar and molasses from non-British ports. The British government hoped this act would stop colonists from buying sugar from French and Dutch traders. The taxes angered many colonists. They wanted sugar that cost less, even if they were buying it from Great Britain's enemies. The following year, the British passed the Stamp Act. This required colonists to pay a tax on business and legal documents, newspapers, and other materials printed in the colonies. The colonists were outraged, and many refused to pay. Representatives from several colonies met in New York to protest the Stamp Act. They pointed out that the colonists were British subjects and should have the same rights as people living in Great Britain. They said it was their right that only their elected representatives could tax them, but they had no representatives in Parliament, so Parliament should not tax the colonies. They said that ignoring their rights was tyranny, or the cruel or unfair use of power. The slogan, "Taxation without representation is tyranny," became popular. When colonists stopped buying British goods, it hurt British merchants. Also, Parliament realized that they would probably never collect much revenue from this tax, so the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. Tax stamps such as the one on these pages could be attached to printed materials to show that the tax had been paid. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, it also passed the Quartering Act. This law required colonists to care for British soldiers stationed in the American colonies. Colonists were responsible for providing food, drink, housing, coal or firewood, and candles to troops stationed in their towns. Colonists who resented the Quartering Act often provided fewer supplies than the soldiers needed. The colony of New York had to support the largest number of soldiers, so tensions were greatest there. When the New York Assembly refused at first to assist with quartering British troops, a fight occurred and a colonist was wounded. At the same time Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, it passed a law that stated that Parliament had the right to tax colonists even without representation. The next year, colonists learned what the next taxes would be. Tea and the East India Company. In the 1700s, the East India Company began carrying tea from China to Great Britain and the colonies. Tea became very popular. In Great Britain, it became more popular than drinks that were taxed, so soon tea was taxed. Tea smuggling became common, which hurt the East India Company. However, the company was a source of revenue for the British government, so the government tried to protect the company. This would later lead to problems in the colonies. In 1767, Britain passed the Townshend Acts. One of these laws prohibited the New York Assembly from conducting business until it met the requirements of the Quartering Act. Another law created tariffs on many imported goods. A third act established a system of customs or tax collection in the colonies. In 1768, soldiers were sent to Boston to keep order and to enforce the Townshend Acts. Angry colonists organized boycotts of British goods, which hurt British merchants. On March 5, 1770, the British Parliament agreed to repeal some of the taxes. However, it did not repeal the tax on tea. That same day, an incident occurred in Boston that would dramatically increase anti-British feelings in the colonies: the Boston Massacre. On March 5, 1770, an unfriendly crowd surrounded a group of British soldiers outside the Custom House. According to some reports, the crowd quickly grew in size, and people began yelling at the soldiers and throwing things at them. The commanding officer told his soldiers to hold their fire, but a snowball hit one of the soldiers. Startled, first one soldier and then another fired into the crowd. 3 people were killed. 8 more were wounded. 2 of the wounded later died. Patriots called the incident a massacre, or the needless killing of a large number of people. Although the killing of 5 people is not truly a massacre, it was a violent event that showed how strained feelings were between the colonists and the British. The Patriots used the incident, which they called the Boston Massacre, to stir up anti-British feelings among the colonists. This picture by Paul Revere is not really accurate, but it shows how the people of Boston felt about the shootings. It helped fuel anti-British feelings. John Adams. John Adams was a patriot who opposed both the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, but he knew that it was important to protect the rights of the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. His defense of the soldiers made him unpopular for a time, but Adams continued to be an important patriot leader. In 1797, he became the 2nd President of the United States. Like many colonists, Samuel Adams thought the use of soldiers against civilians was wrong. He proclaimed the Boston Massacre a battle for American liberty. The British soldiers who participated in the Boston Massacre were put on trial. John Adams, a cousin of Samuel Adams, defended them. Adams argued that the crowd had started the fight with the soldiers, and therefore the soldiers were innocent of murder. 2 of the soldiers were later found guilty of manslaughter, or killing people without intending to. In keeping with the custom of the time, the 2 soldiers were branded on their thumbs as punishment. After the massacre, the British withdrew their troops from Boston shortly after the Boston Massacre, thanks in part to the efforts of Samuel Adams. In 1772, Adams and other Boston leaders formed a Committee of Correspondence. Express riders delivered their correspondence or letters to other communities. These letters kept people informed of events and helped unite the colonies. Samuel Adams also organized resistance to the next new British law, the Tea Act. The tax on tea still existed after the Townshend Acts were repealed in 1770 because the British government wanted to show that it had the right to tax the colonies. However, the colonists had avoided paying the tax by buying tea smuggled in by Dutch traders. In 1773, the British passed the Tea Act, a law that reduced taxes on tea and made it easier for the East India Company, a large British company, to sell tea in the colonies. The East India Company's tea would be able to compete with the smuggled tea because their prices would be the lowest available, even though the tea was still taxed. But the colonists did not like the idea of the British government taxing the colonists, and despite the lower price, they would not buy the tea. This is the Boston Massacre Monument in Boston, Massachusetts. This picture shows the Patriots dumping the tea during the Boston Tea Party. Merchants in most cities canceled tea orders. However, the British-appointed governor in Boston wanted to obey the law. He insisted that 3 ships waiting in the harbor be allowed to unload their cargo of tea, and that they be paid for it. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of about 60 patriots disguised as Mohawks boarded the ships. A large crowd came with them and watched as chest after chest of tea was dumped into the harbor. Colonists knew this was an important event, and some collected samples of tea as souvenirs. This bottle was filled with tea by T.M. Harris. Notice that the date on the label is the day after the Boston Tea Party. The colonies unite. Parliament passed several laws in 1774 to punish Bostonians for the Boston Tea Party. Colonists called these the Intolerable Acts because they were intolerable or unbearable. The port of Boston was closed, unapproved town meetings were banned, and British soldiers returned. Samuel Adams sent letters throughout the colonies pointing out that Britain could interfere with other colonial governments just as it had in Massachusetts. From September 5th to October 26, 1774, representatives from every colony except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They voted to stop trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. Most representatives did not call for independence, but they agreed that each colony's militia should be strengthened. They also agreed to a second meeting in May 1775 if Britain had not changed its policies by then. As you read at the beginning, Britain did not change its policies. Instead, it decided to arrest the Patriot leaders. British soldiers marched to Lexington, and the shot heard round the world was fired, starting the Revolutionary War. Key events in the conflict. 1763. The French and Indian War ends. 1764. Parliament passes the Revenue Act of 1764, also called the Sugar Act. 1765. The Quartering Act of 1765 and the Stamp Act are enacted by Parliament. 1766. Parliament abolishes the Stamp Act, but passes the Declaratory Act. 1767. Parliament passes the Townshend Acts. 1770. March 5th. Parliament repeals the Townshend Acts except for the tax on tea. The Boston Massacre occurs. 1773. Parliament passes the Tea Act. December 16th. The Boston Tea Party occurs. 1774. Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts. September 5th to October 26th. The First Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. 1775. April 19th. The Revolutionary War in America begins.